Chapter 3, Lying in her bed, Queen Kausalya of Ayodhya appeared frail and worn. All of 40, her prematurely grey hair seemed incongruous against her dark, still gleaming skin. Though short in stature, she'd once been strong. In a culture that valued women for their ability to produce heirs, being childless had broken her spirit. Despite being the senior-most wife, King Dashrath acknowledged her only on ceremonial occasions. At most other times, she was relegated to obscurity, a fact that ate away at her. All she desired was a fraction of the time and attention that Dashrath lavished on his favorite wife, Kakeyi. She was keenly aware that giving birth to an heir, hopefully Dashrath's first son, had the potential to dramatically alter her status. No wonder, then, that today her spirit was all fired up, even though her body was weak. She had been in labor for more than 16 hours, but she barely felt the pain. She soldiered on determinedly, refusing the doctor her permission to perform a surgical procedure to extract her baby from her womb. "My son will be born naturally," announced Kausalya firmly. A natural birth was considered more auspicious. She had no intention of putting the future prospects of her child at risk. "He will be king one day," continued Kausalya. "He will be born with good fortune." Nilanjana sighed. She wasn't even sure if the child would be a boy. But she wouldn't risk the merest flagging of her mistress' spirits. She administered some herbal pain relievers to the queen and bided her time. Ideally, the doctor wanted the birth to take place before midday. The royal astrologer had warned her that if the child was born later, he would suffer great hardships throughout his life. On the other hand, if the child was born before the sun reached its zenith, he would be remembered as one of the greatest among men and would be celebrated for millennia. Nilanjana cast a quick glance at the Prabhar lamp, which measured time in 6-hour intervals. The sun had already risen and it was the 3rd hour of the 2nd Prabhar. In another 3 hours it would be midday. Nilanjana had decided to wait till a half-hour before noon and, if the baby was still not born, she would go ahead with the surgery. Kausalya was stricken with another bout of dilatory pain. She pursed her lips together and began chanting in her mind the name she had chosen for her child. This gave her strength, for it wasn't an ordinary name. The name she had picked was that of the 6th Vishnu. Vishnu was a title given to the greatest of leaders who were remembered as the propagators of good. The 6th man to have achieved this title was Lord Parshuram. That is how he was remembered by the common folk. Parshu means axe, and the word had been added to the name of the 6th Vishnu because the mighty battle axe had been his favorite weapon. His birth name was Ram. That was the name that reverberated in Kausalya's mind. Ram. 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 The 4th hour of the 2nd Prahar saw Dashrath battle ready. He had hardly slept the previous night, his self-righteous rage having refused to dissipate. He had never lost a battle in his life, but this time it was not mere victory that he sought. Redemption now lay in his vanquishing that mercenary traitor and squeezing the life out of him. The Ayodhyan emperor had arranged his army in a Suchi Vyuha, the needle formation. This was because Kubur's hordes had planted dense thorny bushes all around the Karachapa fort. It was almost impossible to charge from the landward side of the port city. Dashrath's army could have cleared the bushes and created a path to charge the fort, but that would have taken weeks. Kubur's army had scorched the earth around Karachapa, and the absence of local food and water ensured that Dashrath's army did not possess the luxury of time. They had to attack before they ran out of rations. More importantly, Dashrath was too angry to be patient. Therefore, he had decided to launch his attack from the only strip of open land that had access to the fort of Karachapa, its beach. The beach was broad by usual standards, but not enough for a large army. Hence, Dashrath's tactical decision to form a Suchi Vyuha. The best troops, along with the emperor, would man the front of the formation, while the rest of the army would fall in a long column behind. They intended a rolling charge, where the first lines would strike the Lankan ranks, and after 20 minutes of battle slip back, allowing the next line of warriors to charge in. It would be an unrelenting surge of brave Sap Sindhu soldiers aiming to scatter and decimate the enemy troops of Kubur. Ashwapati nudged his horse a few steps ahead and halted next to Dashrath. "Your Highness," he said, "are you sure about this tactic?" "Don't tell me you're having second thoughts," King Ashwapadil remarked Dashrath, surprised by the words of caution from his normally aggressive father-in-law. He had been a worthy ally in most of Dashrath's conquering expeditions throughout the realms of India. "I was just thinking we will not be using our numerical superiority in full strength. The bulk of our soldiers will be behind the ones charging up front. They will not be fighting at the same time." "Is that wise?" "It is the only way, believe me," asserted Dashrath confidently. "Even if our first charge is unsuccessful, the soldiers at the back will keep coming in waves. We can sustain our onslaught on Kubur's eunuch forces till they all die to the last man. I do not see it coming to that though. I will annihilate them with our first charge." Ashwapati looked to his left where Kubur's ships lay at anchor more than 2 kilometers into the sea. There was something strange about their structure. The front section, the bow, was unusually broad. What role will those ships play in the battle? Nothing, dismissed Dashrath, smiling fondly at his father-in-law. While Dashrath had had experience of a few naval battles, Ashwapati hadn't. "Those fools haven't even lowered their rowboats from the vessels. Even if they have a reserve force on those ships, they cannot be brought into battle quickly enough. It will take them at least a few hours to lower their rowboats, load their soldiers, and then ferry them to the beach to join the battle. By then, we would have wiped out the soldiers who are inside the fort." "Outside the fort," corrected Ashwapati, pointing towards Karachap. Ravan had, strangely, abandoned the immense advantage of being safe within the walls of the well-designed fort. Instead of lining them up along the ramparts, he had chosen to arrange his army of probably 50,000 soldiers in a standard formation outside the city, on the beach. "It is the strangest tactic I have ever seen," said Ashwapati warily. "Why is he giving up his strategic advantage? With the fort walls being right behind his army, he does not even have room to retreat. Why has Ravan done this?" Dashrath sniggered. "Because he is a reactionary idiot. He wants to prove a point to me. Well, I will make the final point when I dig my sword into his heart." Ashwapati turned his head towards the fort walls again as he surveyed Ravan's soldiers. Even from this distance he could see Ravan, wearing his hideous horned helmet, leading his troops from the front. Ashwapati cast a look at his own army. The soldiers were roaring loudly, hurling obscenities at their enemy, as warriors are wont to do before the commencement of war. He turned his gaze to Ravan's army once again. In sharp contrast, they emanated no sound. There was no movement either. They stood quietly in rigid formation, a brilliant tribute to soldierly discipline. A shiver ran down Ashwapati's spine. He couldn't get it out of his mind that those soldiers were bait that Dashrath had chosen to take. If you are a fish charging at bait, then it usually doesn't end well. Ashwapati turned towards Dashrath to voice his fears, but the emperor of the Sap Sindhu had already ridden away. Dashrath was on horseback at the head of his troops. He ran his eyes over his men confidently. They were a rowdy, raucous bunch with swords drawn, eager for battle. The horses, too, seemed to have succumbed to the excitement of the moment, for the soldiers were pulling hard at their reins, holding them in check. Dashrath and his army could almost smell the blood that would soon be shed, the magnificent killings. They believed, as usual, that the goddess of victory was poised to bless them. "Let the war drums roll." Dashrath squinted his eyes as he observed the Lankans and their commander Ravan up ahead in the distance. Molten rage was coursing through him. He drew his sword and held it aloft, and then bellowed the unmistakable war cry of his kingdom, Kosala, and its capital city, Ayodhya. Ayodhyatab Vijatarab. The conquerors from the unconquerable city. Not all in his army were citizens of Ayodhya, and yet they were proud to fight under the great Kosala banner. They echoed the war cry, Ayodhyatab Vijatarab. Dashrath roared as he brought his sword down and spurred his horse. Kill them all. No mercy. No mercy, shouted the riders of the first charge, kicking their horses and taking off behind their fearless lord. But then it all began to unravel. Dashrath and his finest warriors comprised the sturdy tip of the seps in the needle formation. As they charged down the beach towards the Lankans, Ravan's troops remained stationary. When the enemy cavalry was just a few hundred meters away, Ravan unexpectedly turned his horse around and retreated from the front lines, even as his soldiers held firm. This further infuriated Dashrath. He screamed loudly as he kicked his horse to gather speed, intending to mow down the Lankan front line and quickly reach Ravan. This was exactly what Ravan had envisaged. The Lankan front line roared stridently as the soldiers suddenly dropped their swords, bent, and picked up unnaturally long spears, almost 20 feet in length, that had been hitherto lying at their feet. Made of wood and metal, the spears were so heavy that it took 2 soldiers to pick each one up. The soldiers pointed these spears, tipped with sharp copper heads, directly at Dashrath's oncoming cavalry. The pointed heads tore into the unprepared horses and their mounted soldiers. Even as the of Dashrath's cavalry was halted in its tracks and the mounted soldiers thrown forward as their horses suddenly collapsed under them, Lankan archers emerged, high on the walls of the Arakapa fort. They shot a continuous stream of arrows in a long arc from the fort ramparts, right into the dense formation of Dashrath's troops at the back, ripping through the seps and the lines. Many of Dashrath's warriors, who had been flung off their impaled horses, broke into a fierce hand-to-hand battle with their enemies. Their liege Dashrath led the way as he swung his sword ferociously, killing all who dared to come in his path. But the Iodian king was alive to the devastation being wrought upon his fellow soldiers who rapidly fell under the barrage of Lankan arrows and superbly trained swordsmen. Dashrath ordered his flag-bearer, who was beside him, to raise the flag as a signal for the saps and the soldiers at the back to also break into a charge immediately and support the first line. But things continued to deteriorate. The troops on the Lankan ships in the distance abruptly weighed anchor, extended the oars, and began to grow rapidly to the beach, with their sails up at full mast to help them catch the wind. Within moments, arrows were being fired from the ships into the densely packed forces under Dashrath's command. The Lankan archers on the ships tore through the ranks of the Sapsindas. No brigadier in Dashrath's army had factored in the possibility of the enemy ships beaching. It would have cracked their hulls. Unbeknownst to them, though, these were amphibious crafts, built by Kubur's ingenious ship designers, with specially constructed hulls that could absorb the shock of landing. Even as these landing crafts stormed onto the beach with tremendous force, the broad bows of the hulls rolled out from the top. These were no ordinary bows of a standard hull. They were attached to the bottom of the hull by huge hinges, which simply rolled out onto the sand like a landing ramp. This opened a gangway straight onto the beach, disgorging cavalrymen of the Lankan army mounted on disproportionately large horses imported from the west. The cavalry rode out of the ships and straight onto the beach, mercilessly slicing into all who lay in their path. Even as he watched the destruction unleashed upon his forces near the fort, Dashrath's instincts warned him that something terrible was ensuing at the rear guard. As the emperor stretched to gaze beyond the sea of frenzied battling humanity, he detected a quick movement to his left and raised his shield in time to block a vicious blow from a Lankan soldier. Screaming ferociously, the king of Ayodhya brutally swung low at his attacker, his sword slicing through a chink in the armor. The Lankan fell back as his abdomen ripped open with a massive spurt of blood, accompanied by slick pink intestines that tumbled out in a rush. Dashrath knew no mercy as he turned away from the poor sod even as he bled to his miserable end. "No," he yelled. What he saw was enough to break his mighty warrior's heart. Caught between the vicious pincer attack of the brutal Lankan archers and infantry at the Karachapa walls from the front, and the fierce Lankan cavalry at the back, the spirit of his all-conquering army had all but collapsed. Dashrath stared at a scene he'd never imagined he would as the supreme commander of his glorious army. His men had broken rank and were in retreat. "Eno," thundered Dashrath. "Fight! Fight! We are Ayodhya, the unconquerables." Dashrath swung hard and decapitated a giant Lankan in one mighty blow. As he turned to face another of the seemingly never-ending waves of Ravan's hordes, his gaze fell upon the monster who was the mastermind of this devastation. Ravan, on horseback, was leading his cavalry down the beach on the left, skirting the sea. It was the only flank of the Lankans that was open to counterattack from the Ayodhya infantry. Accompanied by his well-trained cavalry, Ravan was shrieking maniacally and hacking his way brutally through the Ayodhya outer infantry lines before they could regroup. This was not a war anymore. It was a massacre. Dashrath knew that he'd lost the battle. He also knew that he'd rather die than face defeat. But he had one last wish. Redemption lay in his spitting on the decapitated head of that ogre from Lanka. "Yaya!" screamed Dashrath, as he hacked at the arm of a Lankan who jumped at him, severing the limb cleanly just above the wrist. Pushing his enemy out of the way, Dashrath lunged forward as he desperately tried to reach Ravan. He felt a shield crash into his calf and heard the crack of a bone above the din. The mighty emperor of the Sap Sindhu screamed as he spun around and swung his sword at the Lankan who had broken the rules of combat, decapitating him cleanly. He felt a hard knock on his back. He turned right back with a parry, but his broken leg gave way. As he fell forward, he felt a sharp thrust into his chest. Someone had stabbed him. He didn't feel the blade go in too deep. Or had it gone in deeper than bethought? Maybe his body was shutting the pain out. Dashrath felt enveloping him. His fall was cushioned by another soldier from among the heaving mass of warriors battling in close combat. As his eyes slowly closed, he whispered his last prayers within the confines of his mind, to the god he revered the most, the sustainer of the world, the mighty sun god Surya himself. "Don't let me live to bear this, Lord Surya. Let me die. Let me die. This is a disaster." A panic-stricken Ashwapati rounded up his bravest mounted soldiers and raced across the battlefield on horseback. He negotiated his way through the clutter of bodies to quickly reach the kill zone right outside Karachapa fort, where Dashrath lay, probably seriously injured, if not dead. Ashwapati knew the war had been lost. Vast numbers of the Saps and the soldiers were being massacred before his very eyes. All he wanted now was to save Emperor Dashrath, who was also his son-in-law. His Kakei would not be widowed. They rode hard through the battle zone, even as they held their shields high to protect themselves from the unrelenting barrage of arrows raining down from the Karachapa walls. "There!" screamed a soldier. Ashwapati saw Dashrath's motionless form wedged between the corpses of two soldiers. His son-in-law lay there firmly clutching his sword. The king of Kakaya leapt off his horse even as two soldiers rushed forward to offer him protection. Ashwapati dragged Dashrath towards his own horse, lifted him, and laid the emperor's severely injured body across the saddle. He then jumped astride and rode off towards the field of thorny bushes even as his soldiers struggled to keep up with him. Kakei stood resolute in her chariot near the clearing along the line of bushes, her demeanor admirably calm. As her father's horse drew near, she reached across and dragged Dashrath's prone body into the chariot. She didn't turn to look at her father, who had also been pierced by many arrows. She picked up the reins and whipped the 4 horses tethered to her chariot. "Hiya!" screamed Kakei as she charged into the bushes. Thorns tore mercilessly into the sides of the horses, ripping skin and even some flesh off the hapless animals. But Kakei only kept whipping them harder and harder. Bloodied and tired, the horses soon broke through to the other side, onto clear land. Kakei finally pulled the reins and looked back. Riding furiously on the other side of the field of thorns, her father and his bodyguards were being chased by a group of mounted soldiers from Ravan's army. Kakei understood immediately what her father was trying to do. He was leading Ravan's soldiers away from her. The sun had nearly reached its zenith now. It was close to midday. Kakei cursed. "Damn you, Lord Surya! How could you allow this to happen to your most fervent devotee?" She kneeled beside her unconscious husband, ripped off a large piece of her angastram, and tied it firmly around a deep wound on his chest, which was losing blood at an alarming rate. Having staunched the blood flow somewhat, she stood and picked up the reins. She desperately wanted to cry, but this was not the time. She had to save her husband first. She needed her wits about her. She looked at the horses. Blood was pouring down their sides in torrents, and specks of flesh hung limply where the skin had been ripped off. They were panting frantically, exhausted by the effort of having pulled the chariot through the dense field of thorns. But she couldn't allow them any respite. Not yet. "Forgive me," whispered Kakei, as she raised her whip. The leather hummed through the air and lashed the horses cruelly. Neighing for mercy, they refused to move. Kakei cracked her whip again and the horses edged forward. "Move!" screamed Kakei as she whipped the horses ruthlessly again and again, forcing them to pick up a desperate but fearsome momentum. She had to save her husband. Suddenly an arrow whizzed past her and crashed into the front board of the chariot with frightening intensity. Kakei spun around in alarm. One of Ravan's cavalrymen had broken off from his group and was in pursuit. Kakei turned back and whipped her horses harder. Faster! Faster! Even as she whipped her horses into delirious frenzy, Kakei had the presence of mind to shift slightly and use her body to shield her husband. Even Ravan's demons would be chivalrous enough not to attack an unarmed woman. She was wrong. She heard the arrow's threatening hum before it slammed into her back with vicious force. Its shock was so massive that it threw her forward as her head flung back. Her eyes beheld the sky as Kakei screamed in agony. But she recovered immediately, the adrenaline pumping furiously through her body, compelling her to focus. Faster! She screamed as she whipped the horses ferociously. Another arrow whizzed by her ears, missing the back of her head by a tiny whisker. Kakei cast a quick look at her husband's immobile body bouncing furiously as the chariot tore through the uneven countryside. Faster! She heard another arrow approach, and within a flash it slammed into her right hand, slicing through the forefinger cleanly. It bounced away like a pebble thrown to the side. The whip fell from her suddenly loosened grip. Her mind was ready for further injuries now, her body equipped for pain. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She bent quickly and picked up the whip with her left hand, transferring the reins to her bloodied right hand. She resumed the whipping with mechanical precision. "Move! Your emperor's life is at stake." She heard the dreaded whiz of another arrow. She steeled herself for another hit. Instead, she now heard a scream of agony from behind her. A quick side glance revealed her injured foe. The arrow had buried itself deep into his right eye. What she also perceived was a band of horsemen moving in, her father and his faithful bodyguards. A flurry of arrows ensured that the Lankan attacker toppled off his animal, even as his leg got entangled in the stirrup. Ravan's soldier was dragged for many meters by his still galloping horse, his head smashing repeatedly against the rocks strewn on the path. Kakei looked ahead once again. She did not have the time to savor the brutal death of the man who'd injured her. Dasbrath must be saved. The rhythmic whipping continued ceaselessly. Faster! Faster! Nilanjana was patting the baby's back insistently. He still wasn't breathing. Come on. Breathe. Kushalia watched anxiously as she lay exhausted from the abnormally long labor. She tried to prop herself up on her elbows. What's wrong? What's the matter with my boy? Get the queen to rest, will you? Nilanjana admonished the attendant who was peering over her shoulder. Rushing over, they put her hand on the queen's shoulder and attempted to coax her to lie down. A severely weakened Kushalia, however, refused to submit. Give him to me. Your Highness, whispered Nilanjana as tears welled up in her eyes. Give him to me. I don't think that, give him to me. Nilanjana hurried over to her side and placed the lifeless baby next to Kushalia. The queen held her motionless son close to her bosom. Almost instantly the baby moved and intuitively gripped Kushalia's long hair. Ram! Said Kushalia loudly. With a loud and vigorous cry, Ram sucked in his first breath in this, his current worldly life. Ram! Cried Kushalia once again, as tears streamed down her cheeks. Ram continued to bawl with robust gusto, holding on to his mother's hair as firmly as his tiny hands would permit. He opened his mouth and suckled reflexively. Nilanjana felt as if a dam had burst and began to bawl like child. Her mistress had given birth to a beautiful baby boy. The prince had been born. Despite her evident delirium, Nilanjana did not forget her training. She looked to the far corner of the room at the Prabhar lamp to record the exact time of birth. She knew that the royal astrologer would need that information. She held her breath as she noticed the time. Lord Rudra, be merciful, it was exactly midday. What does this mean? Asked Nilanjana. The astrologer sat still. The sun was poised to sink into the horizon and both Kushalia and Ram were sound asleep. Nilanjana had finally walked into the chamber of the royal astrologer to discuss Ram's future. You'd said that if he was born before midday, then history would remember him as one of the greatest, said Nilanjana. And that if he was born after midday, he'd suffer misfortune and not know personal happiness. Are you sure he was born exactly at midday? Asked the astrologer. Not before? Not after? Of course I'm sure. Exactly at noon. The astrologer inhaled deeply and became contemplative once again. What does this mean? Asked Nilanjana. What will his future be like? Will he be great or will he suffer misfortune? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? I mean I don't know, said the astrologer, unable to contain his irritation. Nilanjana looked out of the window, towards the exquisite royal gardens that rolled endlessly over many acres. The palace was perched atop a hill, which also was the highest point in Ayodhya. As she gazed vacantly at the waters beyond the city walls, she knew what needed to be done. It was really up to her to record the time of birth, and she didn't have to record it as midday. How would anyone be any the wiser? She'd made her decision. Ram was born a minute before midday. She turned to the astrologer. You will remain quiet about the actual time of birth. She needn't have exercised any caution. The astrologer, who also belonged to Kushalia's parental kingdom, didn't need any convincing. His loyalties were as clear as Nilanjana's. Of course.